they sound great. And trust me, I cannot take credit for that. They all sound this good because they worked very hard. But I did have the good fortune of mentoring all 3 of these students, teaching them on Skype until a few years back. And each of these 3 students came to me at very different times of their lives. One was a high school student, one was already a professional saxophonist, and one was a successful businessman coming back to his instrument for the first time in over 20 years. Each of these musicians are exceptional, and the latter example, Joe, totally debunks the myth that you can't become a virtuoso at saxophone or at music and improvisation later on in life. Because Joe honestly improved at a faster rate than any student I've ever had. So I'm really excited to profile Joe later on and interview him a little bit, which brings up what we're gonna get into today. So over the past year while I've been off the road, I've gotten back into teaching again, and I've actually been doing this Text Lessons membership program, which I know some of you have heard about and some of you are actually members of. It's been really fun working directly with a bunch of really great students at all levels and actually on all instruments. And so I've been working with a bunch of these students for a year now. And I should mention that the studio is actually open right now. It's actually open for the first time this year. It's been closed for a long time. But anyway, I've been working with a bunch of these students for almost a year now. And so I'm really trying to keep it fresh. I'm trying to mix it up. And I thought it might be a good opportunity to kind of go back and check out what's up with some of the students that I used to work with on Skype and actually ask them and interview them about their experience becoming so good because they've become such monstrous players. I wanted to interview them and get a sense of some of the things that they worked on, not only with me, but just the things that they worked on to become such good players, such advanced players, so I could get some perspective and maybe see if there's some things that I could start giving the text lesson students that I've been working with for a long time, and maybe get some insight on the most effective things that I worked with these 3 students, so I could get a sense of what really are the most effective things to be working with students while I'm teaching. And most importantly, I thought this might give all of you some perspective, seeing some musicians who have become incredibly advanced over the years. So I thought it might give you some perspective to get a sense of what you all should be practicing and what helped them the most to get to the level where they're at now. So we're gonna check out some of the highlights of the conversations catching up with these 3 saxophonists. And we're gonna delve a little bit into some of the concepts that they bring up, some of the things that they bring up that really help them improve the most over the years. So all of these guys are playing on a professional level now, but first let's start off with a guy who actually came to me as a professional. He'd been touring for many years and playing all sorts of gigs throughout Alabama and the South in general, and really all over the world. That's Leroy Botiford.
I've been playing for a long time. And a lot of that stuff that you were telling me to do, I was like, man, I never thought to do.
So Leroy came to me already sounding so damn good, but he wanted to take his playing to the next level. And he mainly wanted to focus on being able to play through chord changes and jazz standards at a higher level, being able to really nail the harmony of each chord and really sound fluid in the jazz language. So playing through chord changes was one of our main focuses when we were working together.
As far as trying to really learn and internalize the chords. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that you had me go through the arpeggios and you had me go through like the arpeggios starting on different chord tones.
Right.
All the exercises that you had me doing as far as like the diatonic exercise, like that's really difficult. Like
yeah.
So all that stuff is really like it's really helped me.
So Leroy brought up a couple things that we worked on together there. One was chord tones, soloing with chord tones, and 2 was soloing diatonically. So let's briefly break down both of those concepts. So with chord tones, Leroy and I did a lot of work together working on mixing up the arpeggio shapes of each chord and only playing the chord tones of every chord in a song form. So for instance, if you're on an F7, just improvise with the notes F, A, C, and E flat, but mix up the shapes of the arpeggio so you don't just play the notes straight up or down. A lot of the work that Leroy and I did together, I actually wrote out for him as we were working through our lessons. And this content, which I was working on with Leroy and other students at this time, actually turned into the standards combo package that I put out with jazz lesson videos. This material might seem a little basic for a high-level professional, but it's honestly a lot harder than you think, and it ends up being really beneficial for your playing, no matter if you're a developing player or a pro. And with that in mind, let's get into the other concept that Leroy brought up, which was the diatonic soloing, which is essentially just soloing with the scale notes of every chord, but it's a lot harder than you think to make it sound good.
A lot of focus on diatonic solos too.
I really didn't realize how horrible I was at that.
Okay, well that's definitely not true. Leroy did not sound terrible at that. Leroy is one of the most humble guys that you'll ever meet. But a lot of times professional players don't realize how hard it is to make an exercise like this sound good. And so that takes certain techniques like voice leading from measure to measure. For instance, that would mean if you're going from an F7 to a B flat 7, try using stepwise motion to go from one chord to another and land on a chord tone. So for instance, that would sound like this. When you work on getting that down from measure to measure, it's going to make you sound so much more melodic playing through a standard song form or a set of chord changes. Again, all of these techniques are in the ebooks from that standards combo package if you want to get a download or a resource to help with this material. The content in this combo package is honestly the #1 thing that I recommend to both developing players and professional players, because honestly, the fundamentals are so crucial no matter what level you're at. And so if you want to develop your raw skills and musicianship, this is definitely going to be a really good resource for you to check out. When you're getting into new material and when you're getting into something that's hard or unfamiliar for you, you're going to have to be patient and disciplined. And so with that in mind, it's important to remember no matter what level you're at, even if you're a pro, you gotta take things slow. And Leroy was always really good at that.
Man, yeah, you kind of opened my eyes to a lot of the stuff that I thought that I would get really quickly. I had to like slow it down and really take my time, and like it's a process.
And so that's one common theme that I've noticed in the musicians that develop really rapidly. They're always disciplined and patient enough to take things slow. And of course, disciplined enough to tackle material that's completely new to them, and motivated enough to push themselves into getting into that new material. And so of course, that is one of the benefits of having someone as a mentor, because they can really keep you honest and make sure you're addressing the things that need to be addressed in developing your musicianship. And so I always try to be really deliberate when I'm working with someone. I always try to be really deliberate on getting them into material that's really going to benefit them the most, no matter how hard it is or no matter how unfamiliar that content might be for them. So one thing that I worked on with Leroy is I would have Leroy transpose different phrases. I really feel like transposition is one of the most beneficial things that a musician can work on to improve their skills. It was a little less familiar for Leroy, but he ended up really benefiting from that experience, even though it might have been a little uncomfortable for him at the start.
And I think I had you transposing a lot more than you were before, right?
Yeah. It was. Yeah, you were pushing me. You pushed me good, man.
So a huge part of staying disciplined and motivated comes down to organization. And organization will essentially help you learn how to practice. So when I started working with Ryan, who was the young whippersnapper of this bunch, I made sure to make that a priority.
Yeah,
totally. And it's cool because like I feel like you really you came into my saxophone life at a time where you really taught me how to practice in like a very productive way.
So whoever you're studying with, you should make sure that they're giving you consistent, structured assignments, and also varying the material that they're giving you from week to week or month to month, to make sure that things are switching up and you're staying engaged. That's going to be a really big part of giving you the guidance that you need to make sure that you're practicing and learning how to practice better. So with Ryan, I always made sure that he had a set of assignments and a practice plan lined up for each lesson, because that to me is such a crucial part of mentorship. So of course, that's something that I'm always doing with the members of the text lesson studio. Ryan obviously was already practicing a lot to be as advanced as he was when I started working with him when he was only in high school. But to help him get to the next level, I knew I would need to help him narrow the focus.
Yeah, I remember like one of the first things we started with was like this Lester Young transcription you had me do, like to really work on my time. Like I remember we worked a lot on my time, like in articulation at the beginning, you know, because I think you told me like a lot of the stuff that I was doing was cool, but like a lot of it was out of time and like weirdly articulated or whatever. So you had me do some of those tonguing exercises, like the short, long, and long, short.
All right, so a couple things to unpack there. One is that you would think with the way that Ryan is playing, you wouldn't necessarily think that studying Lester Young is a big part of what got him to be able to shred like that on the horn. But the reality is studying Lester Young gives every improviser a really important foundation that they can build off of. And I found that working on this Lester Young material really helped Ryan start to rein in his chops and use it in a way that was a lot more grounded. But then to build his technique from there and make it a lot more cohesive, we worked on a lot of technique and articulation exercises. So right there, he referred to an articulation exercise that I've definitely showed a bunch of students in the past, especially the students in the text lesson studio. And that is an exercise that I like to call the rhythm trick. A quick breakdown of that rhythm trick would be essentially this. You do two versions of it, and it helps you go from playing eighth notes to 16th notes. So what you do is you start by playing the first eighth note long, and then the second eighth note short. So really the first eighth note ends up being a dotted eighth note, and the second eighth note ends up being a 16th note. That's gonna sound like this. Then after you do that, you're gonna flip the rhythm. So the first note is gonna be a 16th note, and then the second note is gonna be a dotted eighth note, and you continue that from there. Once you've done that, theoretically, you should be able to play that exercise in total double time, just as 16th notes. That's going to be really effective, especially if you're focusing on the articulation. That's really going to help you tighten up your 16th note lines. Then another thing that Ryan and I worked on together that I actually forgot about was the concept of etudes. And this was a great reminder for me because he actually reflected on how beneficial that was for him. And I completely forgot about this technique and how we worked on that together. So I've actually started adding that to the assignments that I've been giving the text lesson studio members with that in mind.
The number one thing I took away from our lessons that I still do like every day is I write etudes for myself on everything. Like I don't even necessarily write them down, but they're up here. You know what I mean? Like I do them either based off of artists, so like, you know, Brecker, Chris Botti, whoever I'm like kind of studying, or I do it on tunes. You know, and that like that is probably the number one thing I took away from our lessons was how to do that and then how to implement it into your own playing.
So Ryan's gotten incredibly advanced and he doesn't necessarily need to write down his ideas anymore. But that kind of brings up the point, which is if you start playing etudes like the ones that I wrote for Ryan, and then you kind of deconstruct how they work and start working on writing your own etudes, and then from there start working on improvising in a way that sounds like a spontaneous composition, that's really going to take your playing to the next level. So that's something that I've started to implement more with the advanced members of the text lesson studio. And again, that's something that I'm working on with the advanced members. I'm happy to work with all levels and musicians of all instruments. So definitely make sure to check that out now if you'd like to get more serious about your development Again, it's been something that I've been doing over the past year while I've been off tour. It's been a lot of fun. The studio is not always open. So if you're watching this video maybe a little while after it released and the studio is not open, just make sure to sign up for the wait list. But if it is open, make sure to try it while you still can. It's usually just open for a few days or maybe a few weeks at most. And it's a lot of fun. You can cancel at any time, no questions asked. So just give it a try and see if it's a good fit for you. But if you'd rather just be self-guided in your development and you just want to work on things on your own, you are welcome to download the Standards Combo Package, where that's going to have a bunch of etudes for you through the ebook on approach note etudes and also the ebook of modern etudes, which uses the concept of melodic cells. And then one thing to keep in mind when you're writing etudes or learning etudes or even working on transcriptions, whatever you're doing related to song forms, try to make sure that you memorize the chord changes first. That's something that players of all levels kind of skate over, and it's really important. It was something that I was always reminding him to do. First, make sure to memorize those chord changes before you're getting into the content as far as playing lines and transcriptions and etudes and all that.
Yeah, with the transcriptions and taking them through the keys, I think I remember always having you memorize the chords first too, right? Like, yeah, I think I even always had you arpeggiate each chord, as annoying as that was, through the tune sometimes.
Yeah, especially like during the weeks where I was like, man, I'm just having a really hard time with this. You'd be like, well, let's just get through the chords, you know? Yeah.
Right.
And I remember in your emails, like you would always leave like a little bit of like a pep talk at the bottom of them. You'd be like, hey man, just remember, learn the chords first, then learn the solo.
So I've always emailed assignments to students, whether it was back then or especially now, with the members of the text lesson studio. I've always sent the assignments in email because it's so important to have everything written down and be able to circle back to that and see everything mapped out for you, and ideally have practice plans going along with that as far as how much time you should distribute into what you're practicing every week. And so that's something that I've definitely been doing with the members of the text lesson studio to help keep everything organized and structured for them, and also to motivate them and remind them about the things that they might not otherwise think of if they didn't have everything written down for them visually. Like with Ryan, I would always remind him to make sure to learn the changes first. And then with Ryan, we also reflected on kind of a nice story that he brought up that I totally forgot about. Coming back to this concept of mentorship, with all the mentors that I studied with, at least all the best ones, I remember I used to get my ass kicked. And so I couldn't help myself when I got the opportunity to kind of teach Ryan a lesson on the fly when we actually got to work together in person in kind of a more professional setting. So pretty much, although Ryan is very young, he is also a really exceptional entrepreneur and jazz educator himself. So he actually directs a program called the Orlando Jazz Workshop every year. And I've been fortunate enough to be a guest artist at that workshop a couple times. So after one of the workshops, I ended up actually sitting in on a gig that Ryan was playing at a nice little casual bar in Orlando. And so I came down and I sat in on that gig and played a few tunes, and one tune Ryan didn't actually know, and so I'll let him tell the story from here. It was fun to kind of reminisce on this experience.
I remember we played a gig together when you came into my workshop the first year at like the Pillars venue in Winter Garden. Yeah. And you called Alone Together. And at this time, I did not know Alone Together. And I remember you pulled me off the stage and you were like, you're going to play Alone Together. And I was like, really? Yeah, I remember this, dude. It was so funny. You're like, I'm going to tell you the changes once. You're going to listen to it once, and then you're going to go play a solo. And I was like, what? I was like, I was like, what? You know? And so I was like, I was like 20 or 21 or whatever. And you're like, yeah. And then, so you told it as it went around, and then he's like, okay. And then you're like, okay, I'm going to go solo and listen. And I was like, oh my God, he's going to make me solo after him too. Like, it's all of like the worst things. It's all of the worst things. And so you take like this fantastic solo, and I'm like, oh my God. and I went up, and I remember just thinking to myself, I'm like, what am I gonna, and from that day forward, it was a big lesson, even though it was kind of funny. It was a big lesson because like it told me, like, I know Alone Together probably better than any other tune now. And then and then also like me realizing that there was so many other tunes for me to learn that that's like something you can do every day, is just learn another tune, you know. And then also opening up my ear on the bandstand, so if someone doesn't know, like calls a tune that I don't know, I can be like, okay, play it once and then I'm cool.
And so this actually brings up something that I just did a video on. I actually honestly feel that any musician can learn a standard after just one chorus if they train themselves and develop the skills necessary in order to do that. And it's definitely not as far-fetched as you might think. And so essentially it all comes down to developing your ears to hear harmonic devices. And so your ears don't actually have to be super advanced to just start getting into this. All you have to do is start getting into the concept of recognizing harmonic devices. And that's actually going to be a lot less hard than you might think if you get organized about it. So this is something that I worked on a lot with Ryan, and it's something that I got into in a masterclass that I just released with Jazz Lesson Videos called Mastering Chord Changes. A big part of that masterclass is about getting into those different puzzle pieces, getting into those harmonic devices. I go through about 20 harmonic devices in that masterclass, which might sound like a lot, but if you just learn one a day, which is totally reasonable, in a month, you'll be able to learn jazz standards way faster by just understanding each of these harmonic devices and then just putting them together like puzzle pieces when you're learning a jazz standard. So if you want a resource on how to go about that idea, just check out that masterclass that I put out. Again, it's called Mastering Chord Changes. And I go into all those harmonic devices in a bunch of different ways that you can recognize them and start to play through them a lot more fluidly as well. But look, whatever you do, if you're getting into a concept that's less familiar, you've got to be brave about it. And courage is always something that I admired in Ryan when I watched him develop. Ryan was always so motivated when I was working with him, and I couldn't help but reflect on that a little bit when we caught up. And I brought up some points about what I think makes the greatest musicians get so good at what they do.
I knew, because you had that fire inside, like I knew that like I could throw anything at you and put you in any uncomfortable situation, and you would feel the way that you need to feel in that type of situation, which is like, that's not going to happen again. Like, you know, I was just taught a lesson. I need to get that down, you know? And I think so often it's easy to feel like when that happens, it's really easy. And I see so many musicians do this. So many musicians say, well, I'm just not good enough for that. Like, I'm not talented. There's something wrong with me. Like, and that's why I'm never going to be an awesome musician. And it's like, no. You just have to want it. And you have to say like, no, I'm going to fix that weakness, you know, because like, man, nobody was born with the instrument in their hands, just like playing perfectly. You know, it's just, it's just about the desire and, you know, motivating yourself and you know, wanting to get better and learning those lessons. And I could always tell with you, like I could always tell with you, you wanted it and you're going to make it happen. And it was just, man, it was just always so fun, you know, just seeing you develop, you know, over the few years that we worked together.
And so reflecting on these ideas, I think it's important to remember that it's never too late to become a totally virtuosic musician. Sometimes you might see a young player like Ryan and think, if only I did that when I was that age, and it's probably too late now. But that is definitely not the case, because honestly, I have never seen a student progress at the rate of the musician that I'm about to show you now. And this next saxophonist, Joe, was able to progress at this insane rate after taking 20 years off of playing the saxophone, which I think is quite remarkable. So Joe went from just playing some nice blues scale licks when I first heard him and first started working with him, to honestly playing down stablemates in all 12 keys. Like, I would actually have to prepare for my lessons with Joe just to make sure that I had the techniques together to get through it, because Joe was playing on such a high level and getting into such advanced territory. So now let's check out some of the highlights from that interview, because I think it will be really cool for a lot of you to check out what Joe worked on and what Joe credits as being some of the factors that really helped him develop at such a rapid rate.
when we started working together, I think you had taken like over 20 years off of playing. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I played here and there, but
Right.
It is fair to say, so my high school band director was a really, really wonderful guy and very supportive and everything. But, it was a small town. And then, I go off into engineer land. And I did play here and there, but I never really studied things. And then, I would just kind of hack my way through.
So when Joe and I first got started together, I got the sense that Joe really wanted to dedicate a lot of time towards his practicing. So for that reason, I ended up throwing a lot of stuff at him. I would give him a lot of content, and every few weeks he would end up getting all of it down. So he demonstrated a lot of focus right from the beginning. And then from there, he started actually developing at a rate that was so fast that I think it might have actually surprised him a little bit.
I'm kind of amazed at what you can teach yourself to do if you stick with it for a little bit.
So when I reconnected with Joe, just like when I reconnected with Leroy and Ryan, I wanted to get a sense of some of the things that he felt really benefited his playing in terms of what he worked on, some of the things that helped kind of make things click for him. So I asked Joe about that, and first he actually brought up, I think, what was a really good point about practicality of the content that you work on.
You're very organized in how you approach things, and I think your students should feel really good about the fact that there's a lot of thought that goes into what is an exercise that if you practice this exercise, it'll just start to come out in your playing.
So obviously when I structure assignments, I'm giving material to the student that I think is going to make them play better. And I'm trying to give them content that's going to be really practical in terms of being useful for them to actually use when they improvise. And so it was great to hear that Joe felt like the material that we worked on together started to come out into his playing, that was practical material to be working on, because that's definitely the goal. But it's also important to note that Joe was really good about trusting in the process. So in other words, Joe would never worry about whether certain content that we were working on was going to produce results. So Joe always just dedicated himself as much as he could to each topic that we covered at each set of assignments, and then so he would trust that the benefits would come. And so with that in mind, Joe brought up a topic that we worked on a lot together, a topic that I think a lot of times for students when their first approach with it is really intimidating. So it was cool to hear that he feels like it was really integral in his development. And I do have to say, I did notice a rapid rate of improvement when Joe really started absorbing this concept.
All of your enclosure work is really good, and enclosures and how do you get the language to string together, because melodies can happen, and then you often need lines that connect these thoughts, and enclosures were a really good, I hate to say mechanical way, but they were a really good way of sort of getting that into my fingers, so that if I wanted, I can do enclosures now until the cows come home. It's just kind of in me, and that's largely coming from your materials.
So enclosures are a way of wrapping around the notes in the scale, or oftentimes, more specifically, the chord tones of a chord. When you use chromatic enclosures to essentially wrap around a target note, it ends up sounding really interesting and melodic because it utilizes the melodic foundation of a chord. But the voice leading ends up being extended through using all this chromaticism that happens around the notes. So that might sound complicated, but all it really means is that, for example, if you want to get to the root of a C major chord with a chromatic enclosure, you could wrap around that note as you approach it with the notes, for instance, D, D flat, and B. So for instance, that would sound like this. So you see examples of chromatic enclosures like this all over the solos of legends like Charlie Parker and Dexter Gordon. So what I did with Joe to help him implement this concept into his playing was I gave him a bunch of exercises that actually use this concept working up the scale degrees of a scale. So essentially we would build these shapes and then use chromatic enclosures a lot of times at the end of the shapes, but sometimes in the beginning of the shapes, to combine them with diatonic shapes and just create some really cool sounding technical exercises. So the goal with that was to help Joe incorporate melodic chromaticism into his technical practicing. So a lot of times people get really stuck in just practicing scale exercises. This really goes beyond that and gets into content that's a lot more practical for your line construction and playing a lot more advanced sounding lines. And then I would also give Joe a lot of phrases that he would take through the keys. These compact phrases that would essentially use a really high concentration of the enclosure concept. So then when he was taking it through the keys, he would just be internalizing it all the more. It's one of those things where, coming back to what we were talking about earlier, you just have to trust in the process and know that if you're working on this stuff and you're internalizing it, eventually it's gonna start to come out in your playing and you're gonna start sounding a lot better because you've started to integrate this concept. If you wanna work through this type of concept together, we can totally do that together in the Text Lesson Studio. Right now, if you're watching this video soon after release, the studio is probably still open. It's open for the first time this year. But if you're watching this video a little later on, you might find that the studio is closed, so just sign up for the wait list. But either way, if you prefer to be more self-guided with this sort of thing, that's cool too. I think it's great to have a mentor to keep you honest, make sure you're understanding every step of the way. But if not, if you feel confident about being self-guided, that's totally cool. And I would recommend checking out the approach notes and enclosure combo package download that I put out with jazz lesson videos. That will definitely give you everything you need in terms of exercises and phrases, like the type of thing that I work with Joe on, and then also etudes over standard progressions, like what we talked about earlier with Ryan.
Another thing that was really good, and I struggle with to today, although I'm getting better, is my articulation. And you had both exercises, and you were gracious enough to stop me and say, you know, that's not bad, but it sort of sucks still. And you'd say it really nice.
So we see here that Joe is extremely humble, and so we're seeing a common theme here between Joe, Leroy, and Ryan. We're seeing a common theme of humility, which I find a lot of times the best players are very humble and down to earth, and they're always just focused on bettering themselves. So I do think that's important to note. But essentially, the articulation concept that Joe brought up comes down to this. There's a misconception that jazz legends simply articulate the offbeats when they play lines that go up and down. Because in reality, usually when they go up, they're actually articulating the downbeats with a dudin articulation. You can hear this in solos from everyone from Lester Young to Michael Brecker and everyone in between. And this is something that I get into a lot with text lesson students, because with articulation, it's definitely great to be able to send someone a video and get feedback on how you're coming along with the articulation and take it step by step. But for now, let's check out one of the exercises that I worked on with Joe. We're actually gonna take it back to that enclosure concept, so we're gonna tie everything together. And again, if you like being more self-guided, this is a concept that I did a full masterclass on with jazz lesson videos, got really into detail with all sorts of articulation type of stuff. So make sure to check that out if you wanna get more serious about this type of thing. So with this enclosure exercise, you're gonna see that there's syllabic notation written here. So what that means is essentially, because there is no way to truly write this articulation with our musical notation system, it actually helps to just be able to see the sounds written out that we're essentially making on the instrument, and even in our mouth if we're a saxophonist, in order to achieve this type of articulation. So with this concept, the ascending version of this exercise essentially sounds like this. And if by now you're feeling overwhelmed with all of the content that we've gotten into in this video, it's important to remember a couple things. One, all of these students took every concept step by step. So we would a lot of times rotate through multiple concepts at a time just to keep things fresh. But in a few weeks, we wouldn't get down a concept from start to finish. So we would always be taking things incrementally. But the important thing was we were always moving forward. We're always keeping things fresh. And I think that's one of the reasons why all of these saxophonists really made a lot of great strides, when we were working together. But all the credit ultimately goes to them because they put the work in. And one thing that they were also very good at, the other thing that I wanted to mention to keep in mind, is that they were all really good at taking things slow. So they were daring and brave enough to tackle new concepts, and then they were patient and disciplined enough to take it slow, knowing that the slower they took it, the more they would actually be able to absorb and internalize the information that they were learning. That's something that I always make sure to remind my students when they start getting a little ahead of themselves. But ultimately, the decision is always in the hands of the musician to take that step back and make sure that they're moving through something at a pace that's going to allow them to internalize and digest things slowly. And so Joe was really great at having that discipline.
And I can remember you saying, slow it down. Just go as slow as you need so that these things occur more naturally, and then it'll go faster.
And possibly the most rewarding thing about reconnecting with Joe was hearing that he's actually been getting a lot of calls for gigs, which to me came as no surprise because he's playing at such a high level. And I think that's really the ultimate testament for how much he's developed as a player. And so for me, it's definitely an honor to feel like I've played just a small part in Joe's development, but ultimately, as I've said several times now today, the credit always goes to the musician putting the work in, and Joe just did so much great work and had so much focus during our time together, and still now beyond as he continues to get better and better.
What's really cool is that you mentioned you're gigging now. That's just awesome. And I think
it was just starting when COVID hit.
Right, exactly. And I think and I'm sure it will come back, obviously, just a matter of time. But I think it's so cool to hear because I have people ask me all the time, like, how do you start gigging? And the first answer is you get good, you'll play gigs because people want to play with you and people, want to call you to play on their gigs and nothing will do it like just getting good, and so I think it's really cool because I have told all sorts of people, honestly, like, oh yeah, there's this one student I had, he took 20 years off practically, didn't really play for a long time and came to me and, by the time we were done working together, I literally would have called him to sub, for something. I would have recommended him, to play a gig, and that's good. Yeah, that says a lot, and I really mean it. So I think it's really cool to see that was happening, obviously just before the pandemic, that you're starting to get calls.
All right, guys, I really hope you learned something today from the experiences of these phenomenal saxophonists. If you haven't subscribed to the channel already, make sure to do that. And if you'd like to work with me directly, it would be great to work with you in the Text Lessons studio. If that's open right now, make sure to give it a try while you still can, as oftentimes it is closed. Most of the time it's actually closed in that capacity. So if it's open, make sure to give it a try. You can cancel at any time, no questions asked. Just give it a try, see if it's a good fit for you, and if I can help you improve at a more rapid pace. That is definitely my priority, just to help you all get better at your musicianship goals. So make sure to check it out while you still can. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.